Is Jesus about to return? Some so called experts say maybe. Today, we're going to the Word of God to see whether or not Jesus told his disciples to anticipate signs of his return. And if so, what are they? Are you ready? This is Biblically Speaking. So, we need to get to the Bible and ask a really important question. Is Jesus about to return? Unless you have been living under a rock, you have undoubtedly come face to face with these kinds of proclamations. Because when there is war, when there is famine or food shortage based on a global pandemic, might I add, or when you have these kinds of events going on, it is inevitable that people are going to begin to speculate about the return of Jesus. And whether it's John Hagee and his blood moons, or it's YouTube pundits like Alan Parr, or it's just your average person on Facebook sharing some article that they've seen, many people are being convinced that there are signs that Jesus is coming soon. But does the Bible tell us to look for signs? Now, among the passages cited by those who hold to a premillennial doctrine are Matthew chapter 24. This is supposed to be the passage with the clearest signs of Jesus' return. Now, if you could look at any Bible commentary, you will probably quickly see that Matthew 24 is one of the more difficult passages in the New Testament. The first thing I like to do with any difficult passage as a preacher is stop and ask, how did we get to this point? What is being talked about here? Are there messages and warnings that there would be wars and rumors of wars, that there would be earthquake and famine and a false Christ, apostasy, and an abomination of desolation in Matthew 24? Yes. But that doesn't mean that those things are necessarily associated with Jesus' second coming. For us to find out, we got to go to the text. Now, to really understand what Jesus is talking about here, we need to go back to Matthew 23. He's just had his showdown with the Pharisees where he's pronounced the woes upon them, claiming they were deceiving and misleading the people and causing them to go away from God. So in 23 and 37, Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, I want you to see something before we go further. Jesus is telling them that the reason why he's talking about this desolation, this destruction that was going to come upon Jerusalem, is not related to his second coming. It is related to the fact that they have continually rejected the word of God, and that there would be no joy in Jerusalem until they were able to rejoice in the name of the one who had come in the name of God. Look at what happens in chapter 24. Jesus is coming out of the temple, and the disciples are pointing out all of the buildings to him. In verse 2, it says, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Now the disciples are troubled by this, and after they've journeyed out to the Mount of Olives, we see that they have some questions for Jesus. In fact, they have 3 questions for him. Approaching him privately, it says, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, before we get back to the text, I want you to see something. Jesus, in pronouncing that Jerusalem is going to become a desolation, is using Old Testament judgment language. This is language God has used before to talk about stripping the blessings away from Judah and Israel. Here's some examples right over here. You can check those out if you would like. But the idea of becoming a desolation meant that their habitation would become a wilderness. Blessings were gone. The people weren't going to be there. He is pronouncing this without any type of reconciliation, except that they would come and turn to the one who comes in the name of the Lord. The reconciliation wasn't going to be a rebuilt temple or a rebuilt Jerusalem. The reconciliation was going to be coming to Jesus. But the questions that he's answering here pertain to a misunderstanding that the apostles have about what Jesus is going to do. They are concerned that he has not only pronounced Jerusalem a desolation, but that he's saying the temple isn't going to stand. Now, they want to know, when are these things going to happen? They want to know what the sign of his coming is. They're not thinking second coming the way that we do. They're thinking about his ascension to the throne, and they want to know about the signs for the destruction of the temple. Everything in this passage is Jesus answering one of those questions to direct them to a more important thought. But the first thing we need to ask is, does he really give them signs? Let's take a look. See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all the nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away, and will betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise, and will mislead many, because lawlessness is increased. Most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Jesus has just told them not to be deceived by these things. In fact, he's telling them that these are not signs of his coming. When you hear about war, that's not a sign of my coming. That's just a birth pang. When you hear about famine, not a sign of my coming. When you see people claiming to be Christ that aren't, that's not a sign of my coming. The real only sign of the end that we are given in this text is that the gospel needs to be preached throughout the whole world. So any time after the gospel had been preached is a time that Jesus could come, because that's the only sign that's really there. Now, because of these things, brother was going to turn on brother. People were going to fall away. They were going to lose their faith because of an increased wickedness. And he wants them to persevere. He wants them to press on to the saving of their souls. Now, the next thing he's going to tell them about is the abomination of desolation. Let's look at that text. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in the house, and whoever is left in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. And unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, the days will be cut short. Now, Jesus begins to talk here in this section about the abomination of desolation. Now, this is something that Daniel talks about in two different locations. The first is chapter 11 and 12, and he specifically links that abomination to the Greek invading army. But this other place happens earlier in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, where he is counting the weeks to the time of the Messiah and the restoration of the temple before Jesus came. Now, at the end of that 70 weeks, after they've killed the Messiah, you have the proclamation that a prince who is not yet a king was going to make a strong covenant with the people being a reference to the Jews. The idea of a strong covenant is not one that is a covenant that is a mutually guaranteed covenant between two people who are very sure of their ability to keep it. It is something that he is forcing the people into. He has the strength, they are forced to accept it. But in the middle of this covenant, he cuts off sacrifices. And all of this happens on the wings of abomination. That is what Jesus is talking about. And it's a pretty accurate description of what Titus Flavius did in AD 70. Jesus is talking about things, as we're going to see in a moment, that this generation is going to see. So, what we're beginning to see is a diverging of the two thoughts, the difference between his coming and the destruction of the temple. Let's go back to the text. Now, if you want to see the differentiation between these two, you just have to look at his warning in verse 24. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner room, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. And wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, some of your translations will say, there the eagles will gather. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice here is Jesus is separating his coming from the events of the temple. The idea of his coming here is a special Greek word. We don't talk about Greek very often in this channel, but it's important in this one. And thank you to Kyle Pope for sharing an article with me that helped me better understand this. Kyle's been on this program before, but it's the Greek word parousia. Parousia is the word not for when someone comes with the authority of another, but for the presence of someone. That Jesus is saying there are going to be people who say these events of the temple are linked to my return, and then you're going to have people claiming to be the Christ. He says, when I come, nobody's going to doubt it. That it's going to be like lightning. Everybody's going to see it. There's going to be no doubt at the fact that I have returned. It's a lot like Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. Now, the next phrase that becomes difficult shows up in verse 29 when Jesus says that immediately after the tribulation, so he's going back to that time when he says there's never been a tribulation like this before. Josephus, the historian, says that 1 million people were killed in Jerusalem within just a few days, and 90,000 were taken captivity. But what Jesus says is immediately after the tribulation of those days, verse 29, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels and a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. What Jesus is essentially saying here is there aren't any other signs. That my coming is going to happen after that, and it will be related to that. But there's not a time element here. And I'm going to show you that in just a second, why any kind of time element is impossible. And what we see from this is this warning. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So he begins to talk about signs that they can observe. Now, obviously, Jesus did not return in the first century. They couldn't have seen a sign in the heaven. They couldn't have seen him coming on the clouds. But there were things a member of that generation could observe, and that was the destruction of the temple. The only question they asked regarding time was when that desolation of Jerusalem and when that destruction of the temple was going to take place. Jesus tells them the time. Before this generation dies, you will see these things come to pass. He's not talking about his return. They didn't ask him about the time of his return. They asked him about the time of the destruction of the temple. Now, if you really want to drive this home, look at what it says in the next verse. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. But of the day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now we're going to talk about the rapture language in another episode. I could do a whole episode on that, and I don't want to get lost in that today. But I want you to understand what he just said. Jesus is telling them, I couldn't tell you when this is going to happen because I've not yet known it. Angels can't tell you, men cannot tell you. Well, why? Because only the Father knows. That means Jesus can't give them a time. He cannot tell them that this generation, and people like to spin this idea of generation and what it could mean, but Jesus couldn't tell them that this generation will not pass away before the coming of the day of the Lord if he doesn't know when it will be. And what that means is that we have to divide this between two different thoughts. Is Jesus talking about signs of his return or signs of the destruction of the temple? If all of these things that he's talking about are different from his coming because of what he says in verse 27, then he has to be talking about signs regarding the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. I can tell you, this generation's not going to die off before these things come to pass. But regarding the day of the Son of Man that you're asking about signs of and my coming, I cannot tell you when that will happen. But what he can tell them is really the thing that he wants to get to. And that is not to look for signs, but to live in readiness. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert, and he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. When you turn over and you look at the language of the Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5, where he says the day of the Lord is going to come as a thief in the night, or Peter that talks about the destruction of the world and the elements melting with a fervent heat that he calls the day of the Lord, he again says it's coming like a thief in the night in 2 Peter 3. What we know is that there are not signs that we can watch for. But because we want to be ready, we live in readiness. And to help them understand this, Jesus told them 3 parables. So, what do we learn from this? Well, despite there being a lot of strange things going on in the world right now, a lot of difficulty, a lot of tribulation, a lot of stress and tears, we cannot say for certain when Jesus is returning. But what we can do is live every day in readiness. Well, that's our show. If you want more of this kind of content, be sure to check out some short videos over here that I did on specific passages of Scripture that are misused, or some longer content on the book of Revelation if you'd really like to get into that. I also have some links to some evidences videos right down here. And don't forget to check out the Man Up podcast. I hope that you will, and I hope that you benefit from it. As always, have a good day, and God bless.